Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York, and we meet with you every Sunday evening on MNN at 8 p.m. The show is repeated on Thursday evening on MNN4, also at 8 p.m. We're so glad that you've joined us again as we continue to dialogue with dedicated and idealistic individuals who envision and use their energy to help build great mass movements for peace and justice that can transform America and the world. We deeply appreciate and need your support and feedback for these individual and collective efforts. We really are all in this struggle together. Great artists who also become great activists are often at the vanguard of progressive change. As they use their talent, they're one of the first who meet resistance by the political, economic, and moral order, because they're frequently one of the first to see beneath the emperor's clothes. They offer courage for the rest of us as we are amused, challenged, inspired, and intrigued by their energy and art. Make no mistake of it, this is serious business, done in a way often to shock, subvert, challenge, and poke fun at the pompous hypocrisies of the system. The smoke and mirrors that often are used by ruling elites to control and pacify us. These artists do it in ways that many of us would like to emulate, but for whatever reason simply can't or won't. It's one of those unanswerable questions that's best left to the awe and wonder of our imagination. Whether it's the artistry that leads to the activism or the activism, the artistry, it's, again, probably best to just let it be and enjoy the beauty and creation of these blessed individuals. This evening, we're truly fortunate to have on the show two of the most incredibly talented and creative human beings performing and working today. They inspire so many of us who come in contact with them around the world. And they use their art and activism to create beauty and the sort of progressive energy that can sustain and nurture people. They can also create a righteous indignation and raise consciousness about the struggles people are facing and enduring and about possible progressive change they can help bring about. Gina Belafonte has spent her life in the arenas of entertainment and activism. As the youngest child of Julie and Harry Belafonte, Gina followed her early childhood environment by immersing herself in activism. She worked many years as an actress in New York City until moving to Hollywood, where she produced theater and an award-winning documentary on her father's life, Sing Your Song. She is now the co-director of Sankofa.org, a social justice organization that enlists the support of today's most celebrated artists and influential individuals in collaboration with grassroots partners to elevate the voices of the disenfranchised, promoting peace and equality. Felipe Cordonell, better known by his stage name, Immortal Technique, is considered by many as the premier political rapper of his generation. Most of his lyrics focuses on controversial debates on global politics. His lyrics are largely commentary on issues such as class struggles, socialism, poverty, religion, government imperialism, and institutional racism. Felipe is one of the very few independent musicians and rap artists who retains control of his artistry through his own label and production company, Viper Records. And seeking even greater worlds to conquer, Felipe has graciously agreed to be one of my co-hosts on this program as his schedule allows. And I graciously accept that offer. Welcome, Gina and Felipe, to the Radical Imagination. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. It's really an honor and a privilege.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having me. So you two know each other, right? For several years. How did you meet?
A couple of years.
couple of years being to collaborate. And
from what I gather, I was told about an organization that was starting
which was called Sankofa.
Right.
And it was something very new, something very radical, where we tried another approach of reaching artists and getting them to participate more in politics and in the necessity for having a progressive and social change. This is what, from my understanding, was. The reality is that we've tried a lot of other things. And by other things, I mean the sort of negative attacks towards artists that say, oh, you're not doing enough, you're not this, you're not that. But I feel like there was a genuine conversation that was started. There were people that I didn't even expect had that type of mentality to then all of a sudden become involved. Obviously, my name is probably one of the least famous people that are involved, but I think that it's something that speaks volumes to the necessity that a lot of artists have to have a voice, to want to connect with the struggle, but feeling like they sometimes live in an ivory tower far away from the people that love their music, but whose struggles they represent in their heart. You know, it's obvious that not everybody that is a successful artist lives like, you know, Louis XVI or Marie Antoinette. The majority of them really do have a social conscience, and they have the desire to express it. I feel that Sankofa addresses that desire directly, and I have had a very positive working relationship with just about everybody there.
This is natural for you to...
It's organic, in the sense that, you know, listen, I'm a person that doesn't like things that are convoluted and contrived. That's one of my major issues with presidential politics going on now, with even local politics. I feel that it's tainted by that. But when you see people that work and they're not being showered with these CEO salaries, they're doing it from a volunteer perspective. They're cutting their teeth to try and meet a deadline and make sure that individuals know that there's a place for them to have a voice that doesn't just go along with the industry standard of, okay, we're here to make a hit and make money. Well, we're also here to raise consciousness and raise the standard. I was asked as a very young artist, you know, what's more important than money and hoes by producers and by A&Rs? And my response to them was always family. That's what's more important to me. And the people that are out there that are suffering or struggling, whether or not we choose to see them as part of our global community and as part of our people, that is an individual choice for others to make, whether it pertains to what their level of activism or compassion is. But for me, it's never been a conundrum. I've always seen that as my role being intrinsically linked to that. I think Gina can probably speak a lot more to specifics on how that works. But you know, I think it's definitely something that I consider a game changer going into the future, because we're going to have a lot of people that emulate. Obviously, you know, when you come out with something successful and original, people want to imitate it. And I don't think that any of us would be angry at that, in the sense that we want that to happen at some point, for people to come up with their own ideas and their own solutions to the problems, you know. I tell people a lot of times politics is like mathematics. There are several different solutions to the same problem, and all of them work in different ways.
So Gina, you created and came up with this idea, and
I so wish I could take full credit for that.
Well, do. Why
no,
not?
Absolutely, I will not.
Okay.
As you said earlier, I had the good fortune of producing a documentary film on the life of my father, Harry Belafonte, and in the process of doing that documentary, which took us 7 years to conclude, with the brilliant genius of director Suzanne Rostock, who really was the artistic mastermind in the way in which that film finally, you know, hit the screens, and I'm grateful for her collaboration. But in the process of making that film, I realized that moving forward, I would probably want to do my best to find a way in which to work with my father and help bring to fruition any idea he had. And hopefully the ideas that he would have would be ones that I'd be interested in working on. And to my great fortune, I've discovered that everything since we've worked on Sing Your Song has been very rewarding and very exciting, and I've worked on just about everything. And Sankofa was born and birthed out of his vision, and his Genius, and he, to be quite honest, began taking a look at how social justice movement was being funded, and was tired of being a beggar. He always says that he spends most of his time and spent most of his life being a beggar, asking for funds, requesting for funds, asking for people to participate, giving of his own resources and financial capital. And so in the sort of vein and legacy of We Are the World, which was an idea that he had come up with and then asked others to help him bring that vision to light, he wanted to see if there was a way for us to create an institution that could monetize culture so that we could use those funds to feed back into social justice movement. And then that is how, in the greatest way, Sankofa was born. We solicit the support, participation, and donation of artists in collaboration with grassroots organizations to shine a light on specific issues. So it's anyone from a young kid that nobody's ever heard of who's a great, poet, to Usher and John Legend and others, who have come on board. We work with our artists the same way. We treat our artists all the same. We hope to be able to provide resources and connectivity to all of our artists in the same way. Some artists obviously come to the table with resources, which is very helpful. And those that don't, we do our best to try and integrate and elevate the platforms for them, and also use some of our lesser-known artists who have a well-rounded knowledge of social justice movement to help support some of the artists who are more well-known but don't have necessarily the political acumen or don't know quite the workings of movement. Our grassroots organizations are the same. We work with a multiplicity of organizations, and please go on our website, www.sankofa.org, and see who we are working with.
Give us a couple names.
Barrios Unidos, the Burns Institute, Peace is a Lifestyle. We work with the Actors Gang, with Homeboy Industries. We work with the Justice League, the Gathering for Justice. We work with a lot of different organizations. And for instance, a good example is the Justice League, or I should say the Gathering for Justice / the Justice League, came to us on 2 different occasions to help support the work that they were doing. And we were able to collaborate with them on 2 wonderful experiences. One was the Guild Conference that the Gathering for Justice produced last year, and we helped to finance that and helped coordinate other artists to participate in that 3-day conference around juvenile justice and mass incarceration. It was a beautiful convention, I'll say. And also they came to us when they, in response to the murder of Eric Garner, wanted to do a march from Staten Island to the steps of the White House, and asked us also to pull our resources together to help them coordinate their rally that they had on the steps of the Capitol, and also help promote and support their activities on our social media networks, and to let our other artists know and those who could participate to join in this particular issue and mission.
Incredible, incredible. So this is a structured organization. How old is the organization?
We're 2 years old.
2 years old.
Still,
Okay,
growing and have many growing pains in the process of that. But we're getting a lot accomplished.
Sounds like it.
My father's 89 this March 1st, 2016, and he feels like there's a lot he wants to do in the winter of his winter years, and Sankofa.org is not only a very serious institution in the legacy of him, but also is a playground for his imagination and for his artistry and for his need to educate as many young artists as possible around the issues around movement and Black empowerment and integration and social justice.
What an incredible experience you must have now with your father. This tremendous idea that you're putting together and helping him with his own vision as a young man. It must have brought you together even closer.
It has, and
Yeah. It's incredible.
I do my best in trying to be as authentic as possible in my life with everybody.
Right.
And I wouldn't be doing this with my father if it wasn't because it fed something within myself that I needed to support, which is my own passion around issues and the specific issues that Sankofa addresses. We have 4 main issues that we address. We address juvenile justice and mass incarceration. We address immigration issues, and we address income disparity. And then the 4th that we took on so that people would not accuse us of not being focused was the banner of violence, because there's so much more to talk about. There's so much more to shine a light on, and we can't list all those things. So if we thought we just said violence, we would be able to address issues like violence against women, or gender violence, or eco-violence, which all sort of comes back to the other 3 in some form or
The
fashion.
links.
Mass incarceration,
Right.
whether it's immigration in terms of mass incarceration, we look at deportation issues and detention, whether it's income disparity, it's poverty, the criminalization of poverty, and violence is really all of those things. And we do our best to shine a light on those specific issues. But again, if an artist comes to us with something that is not one of those 3 main issues, we took on the banner of violence in order to be able to respond and quickly to the issues that an artist wants to be able to shine a light on. Or if a social justice organization comes to us with the need to shine a light on a specific campaign that they have, we also do our best to see ways in which we can collaborate with them in the cultural sphere.
Right. And you came to the organization to shine a light on your particular interests, which seem to naturally mesh, right? Not to make it more convoluted, but
No,
Well, wait,
no,
before,
no?
before he
Oh, okay,
speaks,
what?
before he speaks, let me just
Okay.
say that in the
Tell-
beginning,
there was the word, yeah.
convenings of
Okay.
Sankofa.org, we gathered a multiplicity of artists and thought leaders and organizations to start sort of hammering out what would institution look like? What do we need to start talking about? How should we integrate? What should be the first way, and which way should we
To get it off the ground,
campaigns
in
to
a
get it off the
sense.
ground?
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
And Immortal Technique played a huge role in that. He came to our meetings. He voiced opinions. He helped keep us honest and straight. And he also brought some very radical thinking to the table, which was great because as the institution itself, we have to tread the lines of inclusivity, and so we don't want to alienate people, no matter how radical they are to the left or how unradical they are to the center, I'll say, because there's very few at this point we've been able to engage in what we're doing that are far in any dimension of the right. So I just want to say that Immortal played a huge role in us framing our coordination and our efforts in the way in which our mindset is set to today.
Well, you're doing that in so many ways, with the left forum too.
Right.
So,
I
your radicalization, what did you try to bring to this fledgling?
Well, one of the things I've always talked about is obviously that though there is obviously a social difference in between what the left and the right does, there is a much closer relationship in between the corporate left and the corporate right, meaning the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And I think that moving away from that paradigm, we start reaching to some of the subject matter which sometimes is uncomfortable for people to discuss. I think when we're talking about racial issues, there's a lot of times where I've seen people incapable of having that discussion because they automatically internalize history as if it's meant in some accusatory tone. It's not an accusatory tone. When I have a conversation with something I know a lot about more than someone, we're not having a debate. I'm teaching someone about what is actually going on in the American lexicon of mythology that has now emerged as if it's gospel. So I think it's important to have these discussions. One other thing I'll say about my involvement with Sankofa is that while it originally started with me as an artist, it metamorphosized into something completely different. And I have Mr. Belafonte, Gina, and several other people in the office, and of course Carmen Perez to thank for that. They had the vision to say, well, what is it that you want to do?
You personally?
Me personally, and everybody else. It
Okay.
was an obvious choice. It was not like some Stalinist organization where people were told this is what you're going to do, and this is
predetermined.
People said, listen,
platform.
what is it that really draws you to progressive politics, or what is it that draws you to quote unquote the struggle? And for me, being a young person that was incarcerated from the age of 20 to 21, I turned 21 in prison. I feel like it's always been my responsibility when we talk about that, not to brag about being locked up as if it's some rite of passage, but I have the responsibility to warn young people of all races, genders, him, whatever, or her, but also to explain to them that there's a greater significance to what has happened politically in this country, to try and keep young people away from these decisions, away from being involved politically, away from politics. You know, we have every intention in the world of creating a basketball or a football program in the ghetto when you want to pacify people. But I don't see any intention by this government to try and create any sort of a political debate where we can have these conversations, and whether a child knows it or not, sometimes they say things that cross an invisible party line, which is another invisible border that someone else painted for us. There is a possibility for people to not agree with every single thing that we talk about without attacking them. And at the same time, I feel like, you know, me as an individual, when I started teaching at Horizons, the prison, youth prison in the Bronx, I realized that a lot of these children were geniuses. And what I mean by genius, Jim, is that unfortunately we only look at intelligence in a very, very small spectrum. And that's, we're talking about public acknowledgement of genius. For example, the memorization and the reiteration of some curriculum is seen as genius. That's not genius, that's programming. You know, if we're talking about someone, I know people who are emotionally intelligent, which means that they're a genius when it comes to observing someone's pain, someone's hurt, what they're nervous about. You know, in the sense that they'll say, okay, you know, I know that this is wrong, but I know that the people that are involved are nervous about some other repercussion coming behind that. So can we address that as being the root cause of the problem? Because most of the issues that we face in this country didn't start in the 90s or in the 80s or in the 60s or in the 70s.
Oh my goodness, you know, I have to say, you've just inspired me to consider, if it hasn't already been done, a project with you.
Here we go.
I mean, I think we should take the curriculum-based Board of Education, you know, sanctified history books, and do a series and rework the actual real history around them. I mean, one of my pet peeves around what we're teaching our young people and why we're teaching them and for what reason we're teaching them is, you know, we're teaching them lies, we're teaching them myths, as Immortal said. And I really feel like it would be great for us to begin to develop alternatives to the current curriculum that are age appropriate for conception and absorption.
Howard Zinn's book, People's History.
Yeah, but I mean,
along those lines a little bit.
But absolutely, but the people's history is not going to be read by elementary school,
right?
And that's where we need to start.
Right,
you know, they're still thinking
Absolutely.
in elementary school that Christopher Columbus is someone that we should even consider to be named,
right?
Let alone read the history that they, fictitiously wrote about his discovery of America. You know.
So you reach them through art and music.
Art and music and books and
Poetry
literature
and
and
books and
stories.
literature. Right,
But
okay.
how about telling those same stories in that same curriculum with the real truth? Not to scare anyone, but to really indoctrinate them in the truth. And this is how people worked, and this is how people took advantage of one another, and turn that into what we're trying to create and build currently. And history has taught us this is why we want to change history. Not that we should take history as a banner of some, something that we've won. You know, when we look at Bacon's Rebellion, that's never taught when the word white first came into law. We don't really talk about the Constitution in a way that is outdated and needs to transform itself into what currently exists, and the Second Amendment is a perfect example of that. But I just feel like Immortal, who is far stronger in his intellectual capacity than I am, around these issues, would be, the Board of Education should take him on. And we should have open forum and open debate, I think, with some of our community constituency, with people who are in these institutions and structures of oppression, around what could potentially be other options and other perspectives.
So concretely, what would be the first step then?
I have no idea.
No, I mean, well, you just said you just said just join with some of the community.
I mean, I think
what
honestly,
would you
you have to really understand that. I'll give you an example. There was a great Harlem historian named John Henrik Clarke, right? And he really was an expert in ancient history. And what I loved about it is that he talked about, for example, the separation of church and state, how that didn't begin in the United States of America. He pointed me to an African pope, right? And at first, the children that were there were like, African pope? Like, you mean a black guy was pope? As if that wasn't a possibility, as if this was some unheard of thing, as if Barack Obama was the only black person to ever wear a crown on his head. I think that at some point when he turned to us and he said, who's the original devil, the white man or the black man? And the whole crowd kind of stood there waiting for what he was going to say. And he goes, no, humor me, come on. So some of the young people that were there, of course, they're going to be like, well, the white man's the original devil, he spread imperialism everywhere. And old Dr. Clarke laughed. God rest his soul. He had cataracts, and he just laughed. He was blind. He said, no, it's the black man. And people said, huh? And he said, 250,000 years ago on this planet, there were no such thing as white people. Do you really think that people waited 250,000 years to steal from one another, to rob from one another? All the problems that we talk about in this society are human issues. Black on black crime should be labeled proximity crime. Who drives from one state to another to try and kill someone besides a psychologically disturbed astronaut? You know, we're talking about the reality of what we see, and it's always framed in a ridiculous way. Here's another one that I've decided to pull from the archives. All right, police officers are often given leniency based on their service. I always thought that this was the total opposite of what should happen. They should be punished more because they knew the law. Obviously, they should be paid better and held to a higher standard as well. But the real question is, Jim, what other profession allots that for you? If you're a doctor and you practice and you do malpractice, the guy who killed Michael Jackson or Joan Rivers, do you get consideration for all the lives that you saved before?
Right.
You're a cab driver, you break the law, you kill people while you're driving drunk. Do you get consideration for all the times that you drove safely? No, you should have known the driving laws better than anybody else. As a doctor, you should have known the laws better than anybody else. We're asking not just for the simplicity of change, because change can be depicted in any way. We're asking for transparency. Let the people decide whether it's change or not. Yeah. But if you give them transparency, then at least they know what's in the water. And they can decide for themselves whether they wish to drink the left-wing Kool-Aid or the right-wing Monsanto milk. And if that's what it's going to be, then they should have the option of at least deciding. My purpose and my role is not to create an opinion inside anybody else. It's to give them an idea of it. And I think that,
and
for
speak
example,
truth.
Right. In the prison,
best you can.
In the prison, for example, we
Yeah.
do creative writing and ancient history. So me and Carmen Perez, for example, we did a class on ancient Roman military, right? And they had a formation called the testudo, which is where they put the shields up forward and shields over their head and moved. Testudo, of course, Latin for tortoise. And this formation is incredibly hard to break, but it's not very mobile. So when they learned this, the writing assignment for the day became, tell me about a time, young brothers and sisters, in which you were so well guarded that you let something positive reflect, that you didn't allow something positive to come in. Tell me about all the times in which you put up that defense mechanism that works so well that you reflect negativity and throw it away, but that you didn't allow love to come in, that you didn't allow trust to come in. And automatically here you see the genius of children who write the most compelling stories about their lives. And the reality is that before that, they were afraid to express it. Not just because they thought there would be some repercussion, but because they didn't think anybody cared.
Would take it seriously, and the cynicism grows. Yeah, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that what I've also found in talking with other organizations that work with young people, especially those young people who find themselves in circumstances where they're not being seen, they feel disenfranchised, they're not heard. When they're sort of hip to the concept that they themselves are not the problem, but that the system is the problem, they have a whole new outlook on life. It's really interesting when you are able to enlighten someone or educate someone to the idea that they have self-deprecated for so long and that they're really not the problem. What comes out of that liberation is someone who wants to really work on the issues that are the problem.
Externalizing.
Absolutely, because while they understand, and we all understand as human beings, we have growth constantly until we are no longer. We all have work to do with ourselves. The ego is enormous in all of us, even those who don't have huge egos per se. The fact that we choose not to acknowledge ourselves, in effect, is the ego playing a trick on us. And I think that when we help young people understand, like I said, that they're not the issue and they're not the problem, they find ways in which to have a deeper understanding on what the problem is and why they find themselves in their communities in the situations that they find themselves in, so that they can not only extricate themselves and their community from the issue, not from the community itself, because I'm finding more and more in this movement, people are taking pride in staying in the community and finding ways in which not to let their communities be gentrified. And growing up in New York City, I used to say my mother's white, my father's black, and I'm Puerto Rican, because most of my friends were Puerto Rican growing up. But I have witnessed the gentrification of these communities, and I'm on a fine line around it. While I do feel like there should be a place for people that are not from the community to come and participate, the people who are in the community should have the opportunity to stay there.
Absolutely.
So we need to create, bigger buildings on top of the brownstones, or spaces where, incoming people that want to live in the communities that seem and look disenfranchised, where they think they're getting a good deal, should still be able to get a good deal, but the people who live there should be able to stay there.
Right.
Absolutely.
And there's also a necessity to address the disingenuous nature of a lot of the landlords that all of a sudden cared about the property when they decided to ramp up the prices so that they knew they were kicking people out. There's something
and construction companies.
A lot of exactly.
And the
there was a lot of people that benefited from that. I mean,
Right.
and those people got absolutely no bailout. There was a bailout for a bank that was too big to fail and took advantage of its position within American politics by being an institution that's protected and has political representation. Unfortunately, the people that are being thrown out of their homes have little to no political representation. Their politicians don't take them seriously because they're not the ones that give them the campaign donations. I always remind people, unfortunately, just like in the music business, politics has not become a group of tastemakers. These people aren't tastemakers, they're gatekeepers. They decide and will foment an
and both
agenda.
sides of the aisle, too, like you were saying
Of
before.
course, because at the end of the
One
day,
side
you're
is-
talking about two people, and they use lightning rod issues to try and ramp up the base for things that are never going to happen. For example, you're never going to ban guns in this country. You're never going to ban abortion in this country. And I think that when you look at sometimes the way it's presented, people accuse liberals. First of all, that's not a dirty word. People who are progressive, they accuse them of cheering on abortions. No one's happy about that, but people are happy that there's a choice that a woman has if she's the victim of a violation or incest, or if she's in danger, or she's abandoned by the husband and has the choice to decide for herself. In the same way, I know that there are people who live in a rural area in America, and it's going to take an hour for any sheriff to show up, so they have to have some protection. I mean, I think, though, that when you're talking about putting politics into perspective, that when we reach these far-reaching analogies that I think people use to divide individuals, as Gina was suggesting, if there was an open forum where children who are really the first victim of racism is a racist child. because he doesn't know any better. He's the victim of ignorant parenting and people who create these stereotypes and throw them in their heads. I think one of the benefits that I had of being a New Yorker is getting to see people of all so-called races, because we're one human race, all faiths, living amongst one another. And yet, I do remember New York being a segregated city in the sense that I once was talking to a girl in Bensonhurst when I was a teenager, and people were like, hey man, just be careful when you go and pick her up from her neighborhood. And I didn't understand it until I got there and I realized, wow,
See who was
you know
there,
what I mean? But at the same time, you know, I look at it from a perspective in which this is totally possible what we're talking about here. It's literally the only thing you'd have to do is open a classroom. We're not trying to
listen to the people that haven't really been listened to. That's what I hear
Well,
both of you saying.
It's a combination of that, and it's also, I mean, those who choose not to come into the conversation and have the dialogue
have a right not to.
Well, certainly they have a right not to, but they're also, I think, people who know they're wrong. A lot of them know that what they're doing is egregious. A lot of them know what they're doing is greedy. They know that they're stealing. They know that they're
You really believe that they are that
other,
aware of it? Or are they so distorted?
I mean, I think that they maybe have convinced themselves that they're not,
otherwise,
and, you know,
right? Okay.
And perhaps you know, want to walk through the world with ignorance. But there's a lot of people, I think, that, and there's also those who don't, because they don't understand and aren't really hip to the truth. In which case, they've been fed the lie, so they're going to, you know, bring that lie forward thinking like it's gospel. But Immortal said gatekeepers of truth, which for us at Sankofa is a very important saying. My father's mentor, Paul Robeson, said, artists are the gatekeepers of truth, civilization's radical voice and moral compass. And we like to look at our artists as those gatekeepers, to use their voice, their artistry, their platform to help keep those gates strong, shiny, and clean, and open, so that we can help those in need and those people who want to understand more deeply the issues and ways in which to engage themselves and their communities.
You second that?
I mean, we obviously have a real series of issues in this country that are going to come up in this election. Obviously, immigration is a huge one because you have an entire party, or I won't say an entire, because I know a lot of common sense fiscal conservatives that don't believe the lie that immigrants all of a sudden caused the financial breakdown of the nation. You know, Obama was very careful in saying that, you know, that food stamp recipients didn't cause the financial crisis, that recklessness on Wall Street did. I think, though, that when we're married to a political party, it disables us from actually speaking truth to power sometimes. Because even though Obama is the first black president, that doesn't mean that he doesn't deserve to be challenged about the deportations. It doesn't mean that he doesn't deserve to be challenged about the drone program. And we discussed this. I had a huge debate with people on Twitter after the State of the Union. I was telling them, listen, I understand that I saw the president crying on television for those children. I wonder in his private moments if he's had tears for those hundreds of children that have been killed during that. And just to add to that, if we're discussing the drone program and him and, of course, Sanders' endorsement of that, we have to critically be able to discuss that without being accused of abandoning progressive ideals. Those are progressive ideals. Absolutely. The DNC doesn't get to decide what's progressive. The people get to decide what's that. And I think when we address that, ask yourself a question. If there was a gun that only fired 1 out of 10 times, if there was a missile defense system that the Department of Defense created and it only worked 10% of the time, wouldn't the idea be scrapped as completely inefficient? And yet when we read the drone papers, the scathing report that came out, that Jeremy Scahill put out and others, we're talking about a drone program that's 90% ineffective, Jim, which means that it only kills its intended target 1 out of 10 times, meaning that every single other time when people get killed, they have nothing to do with what's going on. We're creating more enemies than we're solving through this continued notion that somehow it's better to send a robot that doesn't know what people sitting having coffee in Colorado to kill individuals on another side of the world, and it's not effective. It's destabilizing what we say we're trying to do in the region.
I think it's also important that we help people help themselves. And I say that by, it's a far longer story, but my father tells a story about A. Philip Randolph having a dinner meeting with the president and saying to him, talking to him about the Pullman car porters and their plight and some of the disenfranchisement they felt and violations they felt. And the president said to him, I hear what you're saying, and I have compassion for what you're saying, but I ask you one favor. Go out and make me do it. Yeah. We have to get the people. We have to get the people to really put pressure on the president,
right.
And if they feel that what he's doing is wrong, you know, and it is the people don't understand really their power. Most of the people in this country, and a lot of black people in particular, don't vote. And the vote is something that and I understand that there's issues around the vote because what are we voting for and who are we voting for? But unless we start to educate, I think, our communities and politicize them, and they start understanding that the district attorney that's sending your son to prison for 25 years to life, he was voted in.
Political appointment as
well.
You
know, and he was voted in by the person that you chose to either vote or not vote for.
Right.
So the systemic issues that we find ourselves in, we can also educate ourselves in finding ways in which to work with the system that currently exists so that we can, you know, cut away and chip away at some of the issues that we need to educate our people around.
Do you see the Bernie Sanders campaign offering some hope to your arguments here? Or how far can that take us? And that movement too needs to be prodded, doesn't it?
Well, look, on any bad day of all three of the emerged Democratic candidates, they're better than anyone on the right, as far as I'm concerned. But all three of them,
still,
and we're talking about Bernie Sanders. I think, you know, there's a lot of what Bernie Sanders represents that is a step in the left direction. But there's also some things that he supports that are just, you know, unfortunate, given all the other things that he wants to promote and the way in which he's moving. I think Bernie Sanders also potentially gives us a clue or a key into the possibility of a third party. And I think that there's the need for another option other than the Democrats and the Republicans. You know, we're left with those two to choose from, and I choose in my life to be part of the, you know, the participatory democracy. What is it called? You know, I choose to vote. I choose to do that because I would rather have someone who I think is less evil in there than someone who I just cannot vote for.
Of course, that term came from the New Left and Tom Hayden. We had Todd Gitlin on actually a couple of weeks ago, president of SDS, and we talked about that as a necessary tool to push the system toward a progressive stance. And of course, the New Left, as you were saying, I think at the beginning of the show, didn't trust either party. So, but
I think though when we talk about what Sanders' impact is on the campaign, it obviously shows that people in the Democratic Party are very, very disillusioned with what they see as the people who are holding the reins of the party. They feel as if they don't go far enough to address certain issues, that they're not out there dispelling the mythology as much, that the immigration raids under Obama still haven't stopped, and he's been criticized by congressmen in his own party for that. And I think that if you're going to champion progressive values, then you can't sit there and practice that sort of salad bar attitude about human rights. That's not one where you can pick and choose. So you have to address them when they're across the board. If we're going to criticize Iran, then we have to criticize our lovely allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel as well, for their human rights abuses. And there's criticism to go across the board. Does that mean that we're not capable of coming to a rational solution about these things? Absolutely not. How is it that we can invent everything? You know what I mean? Men were flaccid for years, and they invented a pill so that they could old guys could have sex. You can't invent a policy that directly addresses the human rights issues, and you can't address policies that affect women in this country. It's disgraceful. Instead, we're having an argument about whether people should be forced to wear hijab or not, as if that's somewhere on the American spectrum of politics that we directly have to deal with now. We can have that conversation, of course, But at the same time, let's talk about who's trying to take away the right for a woman to choose, and let's take an honest look at how that lightning rod issue continuously is something that the right and the left won't deal with.
Won't do it.
As
Traditional politicians
No, because they
won't.
won't deal with it as a religious issue. You have to realize that when you play, again, and
moral issue, if you
right,
will.
when you play, we said salad bar progressiveness, when you play salad bar Christianity, it's just as bad too. When you say, okay, well, you know, the gay people are an abomination, or the women is this and that, but then what about the other thousands of other things that are said in the Bible that people are selectively picking or choosing whether they choose to adhere the rest of their life to or not? I always tell people, if your religion makes you a better person, if it makes you more understanding, more generous, then it doesn't matter what it is, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, being a Sikh, whatever. However, if your religion just makes you a more judgmental, a more self-righteous person, a person who believes that everyone who disagrees with them is going to some proverbial hell, then not only has that religion failed you, but you have failed that religion because you missed the entire point of humbling yourself.
Can I clap at that?
Well, I'm joining you in that too. I'm joining it, yes. So, so do you see some of these moral, spiritual leaders out there? Are we basically counting on you as the artist, activist, to be the vanguard?
Well, I think
to be the narrators.
I think the artists and the leaders are the future
visions.
of the movement in
I
some
think so,
sense.
too,
First
yeah.
of all, let's dispel the idea that people have to have one career in their life and do that forever. You can have 3 or 4 careers in your life. I know artists that become producers, that become actors, that become scientists, that want to do anything.
I wear a lot of different hats and a lot of different careers, a lot. But I also want to say that this concept of leadership, too, I think needs to be reevaluated. You know, I think that there are certain people, like Immortal, for instance, who can emerge in a way because they're extremely articulate around issues, and they have a passion around specific issues and knowledge. But there are also, as he also said, there are people who are geniuses in the way in which they are compassionate around emotions and are very articulate and savvy in ways in which to support people who are, you know, feeling unhealthy in their minds, you know. So this idea of leadership, I find currently in what we're calling, I guess, the new civil rights movement, or the civil rights movement 2.0, or the black empowerment movement, or movement for black lives, or Black Lives Matter, or the immigration movement, or all of the movements that have been emerging in the last few years around the spark that ignited around Trayvon Martin, I will say, which people, because of technology, I think have been able, or the Arab Spring, you know, have been able, through technology, been able to communicate, and this younger generation has been able to
articulate,
galvanize themselves, organize themselves in ways that previous civil rights movements or previous movements have not been able to do. And what has emerged out of that is a multiplicity of leaders and leadership, and the way in which they themselves as young people view leadership and being leaders. I think there is a concept of decentralization around one person or a few people being the spokespeople. I find in the leadership roles that have emerged, they are the first to say that while this is a position that they and many of their constituency has, that they don't speak for everybody. You know, if you
break down the hierarchy.
Yes, I mean, when you look, especially for instance, in the transgender movement, most people who are emerging as leadership in that space, who are shining a light on the issue of transgender issues, will say, we're human beings. Our transgender issues vary depending on the person and what their challenges have been, what their socioeconomic space is, what their environment is, what the acceptability of their families are, which then I think is a great way in which to look at all of us in this space. We all come from it from different perspectives, different angles. Our relationships to our families and our communities is all different. Our own intellectual capacity, our own emotional psyche is different. And so we all have a different way in which we approach the work and a space in which we can contribute. So I just look at the idea of leadership, because, and the reason why I'm saying that is because I do want to give a plug for an event that's happening on Monday on Martin Luther King Day, which I'll read from my phone the specifics around. But you know, we are we have put on a pedestal for a very long time, and I will say rightfully so in some ways, Martin Luther King. He emerged out of a movement. I think what that movement knew to do specifically was
Get your plug in.
was to choose someone who could be the mouthpiece and the heart piece for that.
Right.
But as we found in the civil rights movement, there are many people that emerged and were part of him being able to put that forward, and he was not the only one there. There was a multiplicity of people in many different ways. And so tomorrow, Monday, there is Blackout for Human Rights at Riverside Church.
Yeah.
It starts at 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. It's in Harlem, again, at Riverside Church. Doors open at 1:30 p.m. and will close at 2:50 p.m. And there are many people who are participating. It's a very exciting panel. My father, Harry Belafonte, will be there, Chris Rock, Octavia Spencer, Lin-Manuel, Michael B. Jordan. So there's a lot of artists who are looking to shine a light on the issues around social justice. And then there's a very vital and exciting panel with J. Cole, Dante Berry, myself, and Jesse Williams is one of the coordinators of this event. And so I encourage everyone to come out to Riverside Church tomorrow.
Monday, on the 19th. Wonderful. All right. Listen, we are literally out of time here. I wish we had a lot more time. We've got to do this again. Thank you both so very, very much for being here for this incredible conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Harlem.
Yes. I'm very humbled to be in the presence of both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Great artists and activists from a progressive tradition often see their efforts as symbols of resistance to privilege and established authority. Their art are acts of liberation and freedom and the hope and possibility of the formations of a new order. They help us see the possibilities of that new order, a freer order, a happier and more loving order of human interaction, caring and radical love. At the same time, they often deal with a much more ugly and brutal side of human existence. They portray the links still alive today between a military-infused culture seeking to dominate through violence and fear, an economic system of greed, mendacity, and war profiteering, a racist new Jim Crow of unprecedented incarceration and police abuse and non-accountability, and a spiritual culture of apathy, moral bankruptcy, and numbness, selling out to the highest bidder. And yet the best of these artists, activists, like our guests tonight, Gina and Felipe, somehow, some way, find the inner strength and integrity to make the historical links of generational memory, to remember and bear witness to the continuing events in and around the country and show how these experiences and memories can come together and pave the way for another and even greater mass movement for peace and justice. For broad-based mass movements to succeed, they need to incorporate what many on the left and progressive circles have often failed to do. Acknowledge, as the Reverend William Barber of the Moral Mondays movement has put it, the movement is about the moral fabric of our society. We are called by a deeply moral and constitutional vision of what is possible. We look at public policy through a moral lens of justice for all and through the constitutional principle of governing for the good of the whole. Academics and many activists, for the most part, have been in a state of denial regarding these moral issues, utterly implicated and supporting the power structure, and as Noam Chomsky put it, interpreting historical events, formulating an ideology of social change that in part falsifies, in part restricts, and in part subverts. It is about radical love, fun, and liberation, and those progressives out there who don't still get that are missing a big part of what really means to be a progressive and a human being. It was a big part of the 60s, the time of the last great wave of progressive peace and justice movements. Woodstock, the San Francisco Summer of Love, reflected in the music and art of the time. Motown, Bob Marley, Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, Harry Belafonte, and countless others. Fundamentally, they got it right. Give peace a chance. Imagine. All you need is love. Hava Nagila. Today, we need and thankfully have the artists, storytellers, documentary makers, writers, musical poets, and troubadours like Gina and Felipe who carry on that tradition. They are in the vanguard for a resurgence of the radical imagination. We thank both of them so much for blessing us here this evening. This is Jim Vrettos wishing you all a good evening. Stay strong and enjoy the pleasures and peace of radical love. See you next Sunday on The Radical Imagination.